Josephine Tey's The Daughter of Time is an unusually intelligent novel built upon a dangerously seductive proposition that if one strips away inherited narrative, distrusts authority, applies ordinary logic to the surviving evidence, and approaches the past as a detective approaches a cold case, historical truth may emerge almost mechanically from beneath centuries of prejudice. The proposition is attractive because it is partly correct, and the novel remains compelling precisely because Tey understands something that many lesser historical novelists do not. Historical reputation is not identical with historical reality. Repetition is not evidence. A famous source is not necessarily a reliable source. And a story can become culturally invulnerable long after the evidential foundation beneath it has eroded. Her invention of Tony Pandy, as a term for a historical narrative repeated until it assumes the status of fact, is one of the book's most memorable ideas, and the larger warning against confusing historiographical tradition with proof is sound. Yet this is also where the central irony of the novel lies, because Tey proceeds to commit, on Richard III's behalf, many of the very intellectual sins she so elegantly exposes in his accusers. The Daughter of Time is therefore considerably better as a novel about the psychology of historical belief than it is as history, and considerably better as an acquittal of the crude Shakespearean caricature of Richard III than as a demonstration either of Richard's innocence or of Henry VI's guilt. Its first methodological error is also its most obvious literary conceit. Alan Grant's investigation begins because Richard's portrait does not look to him like the face of a murderer. Grant prides himself on reading character from faces, and the book repeatedly treats facial appearance as if it contained morally diagnostic information. This is physiognomy masquerading as police intuition. Portraiture cannot establish innocence, cruelty, honesty, intelligence, or homicidal capacity, and the fact that several characters independently find Richard's face sensitive, conscientious, judicial, or suffering proves only that Tey has arranged a chorus to validate Grant's initial intuition. In a detective novel, this is an efficient inciting device. As reasoning, it is worthless. Indeed, the circularity is almost comic. Richard cannot have murdered his nephews because he does not look like the sort of man who would murder his nephews, and once Grant becomes persuaded that Richard was not the murderer, the portrait looks increasingly humane. The novel intends this as evidence of how badly history has distorted Richard's image, but it can just as easily be read as evidence of how readily interpretation alters perception. The deeper historical problem begins when Grant moves from healthy skepticism about sources to selective skepticism about sources. His discovery that Thomas More was only 5 years old when Richard became king is perfectly valid and genuinely important. More was not an eyewitness to the events of 1483, and his history of King Richard III must not be treated as contemporary testimony in the strict sense. Tey is right to puncture the naive assumption that More's later eminence as Lord Chancellor somehow makes him a direct witness to Richard's reign. What she does not establish, however, is the much stronger conclusion that More's narrative is therefore nothing more than the propagated malice of John Morton. That reduction is dramatically convenient, but historically crude. Modern research by Tim Thornton has examined More's social proximity to people connected with the alleged murder tradition, including the families of Miles Forrest and others named in More's narrative, and has shown that the story's early transmission is more complicated than the simple formula "Morton invented it, and More copied him." Thornton is careful not to claim that this proves More's account true, but it substantially weakens the novel's assumption that More can be dismissed as a mere Tudor ventriloquist. Tey's handling of sources is still more conspicuously selective in her complete omission of Domenico Mancini. Mancini was in England during the crisis of 1483 and composed a near-contemporary account of Richard's accession. Modern scholarship has described his narrative as one of the most important sources for the events of that summer. Mancini does not furnish a courtroom-quality proof that Richard ordered the prince's murder, and he depended upon informants for matters he did not personally witness. But he records the progressive withdrawal of Edward V and his brother from public sight and the anxiety surrounding their fate. His existence is especially damaging to Tey's method because the novel repeatedly encourages the reader to believe that once More and Morton are discredited, the traditional case nearly evaporates. It does not. There were hostile or suspicious reports concerning Richard before the Tudor regime had enjoyed decades in which to manufacture an official legend. To Tay's credit, she does confront one such piece of evidence when Carradine discovers the January 1484 speech of the French Chancellor Guillaume de Rochefort referring to Edward IV's children as having been massacred. But instead of allowing this evidence materially to alter the probability of her theory, she neutralizes it through conjecture. Morton had reached the continent. Therefore, Morton may have spread the story. Therefore, the French report can be treated as political propaganda rather than independent corroboration. This is possible, but notice how the evidential standard has changed. When a document appears to favor Richard, Grant treats its existence, wording, or administrative context as hard evidence. When a document points against Richard, he frequently invents a plausible route by which hostile misinformation might have reached its author. The method has ceased to be skeptical inquiry and become advocacy. The treatment of Titulus Regius reveals the same problem more starkly. Tay is correct that Richard's claim to the throne was eventually embodied in an Act of Parliament, and the surviving parliamentary record is real. She is also correct that Henry VII later repealed the Act and had political reasons for wanting the legitimacy of Edward IV's children restored. What the novel does not adequately distinguish is the existence of a legal declaration from the truth of the allegations on which that declaration rested. Titulus Regius asserted that Edward IV had previously contracted marriage to Eleanor Butler and that his subsequent marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was therefore invalid, rendering their children illegitimate. From the existence of the statute, Grant and Carradine leaped to the conclusion that Edward really had married Eleanor and that the princes really were illegitimate. Carradine explicitly reasons that Henry wished the act suppressed because its contents were true. That is not historical reasoning, but a non sequitur. Governments enact false propositions, parliaments ratify politically useful claims, and medieval legality was no more immune to power than modern legality is. The act proves that Richard's regime formally advanced and secured recognition of this argument. It does not independently prove the underlying pre-contract. Tay treats a contested instrument of Richard's accession as though it were an impartial judicial finding about Edward IV's marital history. This matters because an enormous part of Grant's exoneration of Richard depends upon the supposed certainty that the princes had already ceased to represent any political danger. If they were unquestionably illegitimate, he argues, Richard had no reason to kill them. But even if one granted the legal validity of Titulus Regius, this reasoning badly misunderstands 15th-century dynastic politics. Edward V was not an abstract entry in a genealogical table whose political force vanished when a statute changed his legal classification. He was the eldest surviving son of Edward IV, had been accepted as king after his father's death, possessed enormous symbolic legitimacy, and could have become the focus of opposition to Richard whether lawyers regarded him as legitimate or not. Medieval rebellions did not require unanimous constitutional agreement before rallying around a claimant. A living Edward V would have been a permanent alternative sovereign around whom disaffected Yorkists, Woodvilles, magnates, foreign powers, or opportunists might gather. Tay repeatedly points out that other people with Yorkist blood survived Richard's reign, but this is not the decisive point she thinks it is. Potential claimants were not politically interchangeable. The deposed son of the previous king was a vastly more dangerous figure than a distant or legally compromised relative. Tay's use of the succession also contains a more concrete historical overstatement when Carradine claims that, after the death of Richard's own son, Richard appointed George of Clarence's son Edward, Earl of Warwick, as his heir. The evidence is far less secure than the novel presents it. Warwick remained affected by his father's attainder, while John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, received offices and revenues strongly associated with the position of heir and is commonly regarded as Richard's likely intended successor, though even here the precise formal status is debated. Tay turns a contested succession problem into another demonstration of Richard's magnanimity, because the moral architecture of the novel increasingly requires every ambiguous fact to exhibit Richard's decency. The same distortion appears in the argument from Richard's earlier preparations for Edward V's coronation. This is one of Tay's stronger observations. Richard did initially operate within the framework of the Protectorate, and arrangements for Edward's coronation were made before the political situation